Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Skydrift by Emil Petaja. Weird Tales, November 1949. Last night's storm had left the desolate beach littered with drift of every kind imaginable, the flotsam of a harried ocean, and 2 human derelicts as well. The sky was antiqued copper, sheathing the earth, protecting it from the menaces lurking in outer space. Last night the wind had howled like 1,000 demons, thunder had bellowed along the foothills, and lightning had lashed. They had cowered in the deepest, driest cave they could find until dawn drove them out, or rather sharp hunger and cold. The wind had erased itself, a strange calm possessed the nervous grey ocean, but it was unseasonably cold for late April along this ragged skirt of ocean 30 miles north of San Quentin. Big Tom's heavy lips were blue. They shivered when he curled them and spat on the packed sand in anger. "Pick it up, jerk. We need dry wood. I'm freezing my tail off." Bony little Aino shivered too. But he said nothing. He only hunched closer against the wet-smelling sand, staring at a chunk of drift in front of him, clutching some others to his scrawny chest. The piece of drift was half poked into the sand, as if it had been flung there like that. It was about 10 inches long, flat, bleached and smooth. It was like all the other chunks of drift along the beach, half-rounded by gnawing waves, serrated in curious rows, so that you might almost imagine it had writing on it. Big Tom Clegg scratched his paunch, where his cowhide belt divided him. His wide, stubbled face darkened when Aino didn't answer him right away, or do what he said. Then his foot went out. Aino toppled. He almost touched the curious piece of drift. He would have had he not dropped his load and plunged his hands against the wet sand. "I said pick it up." There was that ominous quality to Big Tom's command which had heretofore caused Aino to respond like a well-trained hound, back in the iron cell they'd shared for 3 years. Aino, however, was weak physically. Perhaps he was born to obey somebody stronger than he. Perhaps something in him demanded that he take orders from someone more able to bargain with life than he was. Tom Clegg had appointed himself that somebody back in San Quentin, and since their release 8 days ago had continued to demand servility as his right by reason of superior physical strength. But now, for the first time in 3 years and 8 days, Aino hadn't obeyed his order. "Pick it up." Big Tom's voice rose warningly. He set down his load. Aino turned and looked up. His thin, pocked face turned white. His mouth, it was like a careless gouge out of slovenly turned clay, gaped and showed little overlapping teeth. His eyes leaped with terror. Aino was afraid of Big Tom, especially when Big Tom looked at him like that, his left eyelid drooping a little and his pendulous lower lip pushed out. Big Tom had carefully nurtured this fear, punctuating it with generous samples of what would happen to Aino if he didn't do what Big Tom told him to. Aino's fearful eyes whipped back to the piece of drift in question. He whimpered like a puppy, but he didn't touch it. Big Tom's hand lashed out. Aino rolled across the sand almost to the ragged line of wetness which the surf claimed. His eyes were fearfully open. There was blood on his face. He made no move to wipe it off. He didn't move at all, only waited, until Big Tom crabbed across the sand to him and yanked him up on his feet. Big Tom shook him as a terrier shakes a rat. "Why the hell didn't you pick it up like I told you? Why the hell didn't you, eh?" He kept repeating this over and over, as if it was something past all understanding. After a while, he let Aino loose so he could catch a breath and answer him. Aino gulped air and swabbed a furtive hand over his cut mouth, as if his bleeding was something he should be ashamed of. Spit it out. Big Tom's left eyelid drooped. It's not a chunk of drift, Ino muttered. It's got writing on it. It came out of the sky, in the lightning. Big Tom stared at him. Then he started to laugh. This was rich. Here he had been scared Ino was getting next to himself, was going to stop being a sucker, that he, Big Tom, was going to lose his slavish tool. Ino might be a shrimp and a jerk, as Big Tom continued to remind him, but he could read and write. When they panhandled on 3rd Street in Frisco, it was Ino who copped the handouts. He looked sick, hungry. Big Tom got only cold, stony looks as they hurried past. Those looks said, "Why don't you get a job, you big ox? I suppose you got that out of those damn books in the Stir Library." Big Tom jeered, in sadistically good humor again. "I knew I shouldn't have left you to read so damn much. I should have known it would drive you nuts. That's what books do to people, don't you know that, jerk?" He walked back to the white piece of drift. "Want to see me pick it up, shrimp? What am I supposed to do? Drop dead if I pick it up?" He grinned. "Don't." Ino's narrow teeth nipped his lips. But there was no use telling Big Tom. Big Tom had never heard of Charles Fort or Thunderstones. He'd never heard about the terrors that lurk in the wind and the storm, about them outside. Big Tom chuckled as he reached down and pulled up the flat piece of drift. "See?" he jeered. "You thought it was going to kill me. You think it's some kind of a magic thing, a god even. Is that what you think, jerk?" He walked over and pushed it in Ino's face. Ino jumped back, whimpering. Big Tom roared. "Still think so, eh? Why? Answer me that. What makes you think it ain't just another chunk of drift out of the sea, eh?" Ino's eyes approached the thing in Big Tom's hand timidly. But once there, they clung, pupils dilating. His mouth curved, and then he spoke with a new dignity. "It isn't drift, Tom. It came out of the sky, not out of the sea. It came down in the storm. Sometimes they send something down, or come down themselves in different shapes. Charles Fort calls the things from outside thunderstones. He knew about them, but he didn't know that," Big Tom interrupted with a snort. "So now you're smarter than those guys who wrote those books, eh? Think you're pretty cute, don't you, jerk? Pretty smart, eh?" "No, Tom, I just know. Look at it. It's only a hunk of sea drift." "It has writing on it." Big Tom squinted. "Call that writing? Hell, I can't read, but I know wanting when I see it. Where's your letters?" Ino didn't try to explain. He didn't bother to tell Big Tom that there were books in many languages, and that some languages used different phonetic symbols, and that if something came out of the sky and had writing on it, "That's from being in the sea so long," Big Tom snorted. "It's the wood grain. Anybody with brains can see that. Make good firewood." Fear and worry crossed blades in Ino's mind as he gathered up his load of driftwood. On their way back to the cave, his fears spilled out in words. "Tom, you aren't going to try to burn it?" "Ain't I?" Big Tom grinned. "Just stick around." His heavy shoes squashed a rubbery rope of kelp. "You can't, Tom," Ino cried. "It's not what it looks like. It's alive, like a god." They walked on along the black curve of beach. "You're wacky, Ino," Big Tom said. "I knew it would happen, reading all those books. What makes you say a dumb thing like that anyway?" Ino hesitated. It talked to me. Oh, it just opened its mouth and talked to you. It talked to my mind." Big Tom whirled impatiently. He had had enough. His lips curved in a sadistic grin as he shifted his load of drift and tossed the thing Ino was so worried about down at Ino's feet. "Kick it," he commanded Ino. "Kick it to pieces. See if there's a god hidden inside of it. Go on. Kick it to pieces before I kick you to pieces." Ino shivered, but there were beads of sweat on his face. "Don't, Tom. Don't make me touch it." Big Tom crowded in. "If you don't, you know what'll happen to you." Over the droning of the sea, his voice cracked like a whip. Aino fell whimpering to his knees. He stared at the object they had found. He stared. Wordless syllables rattled in his throat. He looked up at Big Tom. Big Tom's face was merciless. He was annoyed, impatient, and plain sore. His was the anger of a common animal man who has had his limited intelligence outraged, who must have a retraction or he will smash something. Aino's eyes rolled. Behind them, the ocean sighed wetly. Overhead, in the coppery sky, a gull dipped, bleated, and went on. Around them was nothing but desolation. Aino looked down at the thing in front of him. Then, reverently, he bowed his head and touched it with his mouth. After he had beaten and kicked Aino until his limbs were worn out, Big Tom jerked him back on his feet and pushed him ahead toward the cave. He made Aino carry the load. Aino stumbled ahead, his legs like rubber. The sky and the sea and the desolate beach were nothing but a crazy blur to his swollen eyes. But he strained and kept going until they reached the rocky entrance to the cave. Then he flopped. Driftwood scattered, but he held it fiercely against his skinny chest. "Get up!" Big Tom kicked him until he clawed at boulders and managed to gain his feet. "Go on back to Bolina's. Get something to eat while I build a fire. Get going." "I have no money, Tom." "Gee, do I have to tell you everything?" "Panhandle it, or swipe it. Only make damn sure you bring me back something to eat." When Aino weaved away, he grabbed his wrist. "And make damn sure you come back too, because if I have to come after you, so help me, I'll kill you." "Think I'm fooling, eh?" "I'll come back, Tom." Aino gulped. It was near 11 by the time the wide curve of familiar beach met his sight again. He limped across it toward the sea-lashed rocks and the cave. His back and his legs ached where Big Tom had punched and kicked him. His sallow face was bruised and purple with clotted blood, but the sun was warm on his back. He kicked little spurts of half-dried sand ahead of him with each step he took. Aino felt good. "Funny how some days you struck things just right," he mused. "Like this morning in Bolina's. Everybody was nice to him. They smiled at him and were friendly. He had already had coffee, 2 cups, and a bear claw with frosting on it. He wouldn't tell Big Tom about the coffee and the bear claw. Make him sore. The big sack he carried had plenty of food for them both, enough to last 2 days. And he hadn't had to swipe it either. Big Tom wouldn't be sore when he saw all the food Aino had brought back with him. He looked up at the coppery sun and hurried. Big Tom's reactions were sure to be tempered by the lateness of the hour and the emptiness of his stomach. "Beans." Big Tom snorted, peering critically down into Aino's store sack. "I'm sick of damn stinking beans." Aino hastily dug deeper and produced 2 cans of Spam and 1 of pressed chicken. "Where'd you swipe these?" Big Tom asked more mildly. "Grocer gave them to me." Aino displayed his narrow teeth in a self-conscious grin. He said I reminded him of somebody. "Bugs Bunny?" Big Tom grinned and spat as he flicked open his pocket knife. "Never mind. I know you swiped 'em. Heave some wood on the fire. Let's get at it. My belly thinks my throat's cut." They wolfed down their meat and beans in silence. Aino wanted to say what was bursting inside him, but he thought better of it. He wanted to say, "I didn't steal anything. I didn't have to. Everybody was swell to me. Not like a vag who just got out of San Quentin. Not like I was a vag, but real folks." He ate with relish. This seemed to be the most satisfying meal he had ever eaten. Belly filled, Big Tom yawned and slid his rump down and slept. But Aino just sat by the fire and thought. His mind was filled with all kinds of thoughts, new ones, thoughts he had never had or dared to have before. His mind stretched out into the future with a calm sense of well-being. Things were going to be different from now on. He didn't know how or why, but they were. He continued to feed the fire and think, until Big Tom hawked and coughed himself awake. "I just remembered something," Ino remarked cheerfully. "Did, eh?" For Ino to make a statement like that on his own was unusual. Big Tom wasn't sure he liked it. What was coming over the jerk? "That box we found yesterday down near Stinson. What about it?" "It's only a kid's toolbox washed ashore." "We should open it," Ino said. Big Tom frowned. "It's probably got some kid stuff in it." "Mind if I open it?" "Help yourself." Big Tom cleared his throat and spat. "I tried for an hour yesterday to open it. It's only nailed shut and the nails are rusted solid, that's all. We got no hammer, nothing to pry it open, but you can do it, sure." Ino bent down, stepping to the low cave corner where Big Tom had heaved the flat oblong box yesterday when they took shelter from the gathering storm. Big Tom watched him with derisive eyes. The box was sodden and heavy. When Ino started to lift it, Big Tom grinned. Ino's arms were like spindles. But to Big Tom's astonishment, Ino lifted the box easily, carried it over by the fire, and set it down as if it were full of feathers. Then, to his further amazement, Ino proceeded to open it without difficulty. He seemed to know just how to do it, to sense where the weakest part of the nailed-down lid was. He pried a sharp stick under it and lifted the lid off with scarcely any effort. Big Tom watched, and his left eyelid drooped. He identified this with the books Ino read. Big Tom hated books. They represented a threat. Ino was showing him up, doing something he couldn't do. Big Tom didn't like it. "Well," he growled, "what's in it? A toy gun or something?" "No," Ino said. "It's full of money, full of old coins and jewels." At first, Big Tom couldn't grasp it. He couldn't assimilate this fact, that this box that looked like a child's toolbox, nailed shut and heaved into the sea, contained a fortune in gold coins and jewels that gleamed with colored fire when you rubbed the sea scum off. His mind could not easily manage such heights. He tested the coins and the pieces of fire with his teeth, and his mind was squeezed into a corner. It had to accept the fact that Ino and he, two vagrants with shady pasts, between them possessed a great fortune. "Where'd it come from?" he demanded, shoving Ino aside and hovering over the open box. "Who knows? It could have come from China, or from Persia, or Mu." Ino's slate eyes wandered beyond the mouth of the cave to the far horizon, maybe even further. "We got to get busy and hide it, bury it, or they'll come and take it away from us." "They can't," Ino told him. "Nobody can touch this treasure. It's ours. We found the box floating in the surf. That means no one can claim it. It's treasure trove. By law, it belongs to us." Big Tom started to refute him, but something in the little man's voice halted his bluster. It was as if Ino, standing there looking at the horizon, were peering into the future, seeing what must be. Ino's words held conviction. This thing was true. They had found this treasure in the surf, and nobody could take it away from them. As this solidified in his mind, Big Tom Clegg became what he truly was. By nature, Big Tom was a scoundrel and a thief. Ino was a thief too, but out of necessity, because he had been told to be one. You could blame it on the environment, the system, or hunger. But really, it was because someone long ago had told Ino to be a thief. It was in Ino's makeup to serve somebody. Now Big Tom's greed and lust went to work. The treasure was theirs. But Ino didn't matter. Ino was a fool. The treasure was Big Tom's. Ino had been useful, sure, serving Big Tom well over the past 3 years. Come to think of it, Ino had first spotted the box bobbing up and down in a foaming eddy between two jutting rocks near Stinson Beach. It was Ino who had found a stick and poled it in. Ino who had suggested they take it along despite the rumbling skies and gusts of rain. But Big Tom didn't need Ino now. This fortune would buy him other servants, better ones. Big Tom ruminated and gloated over the box. He decided that Aino must never leave this cave. This desolate nook in the rock would be Aino's final resting place. There was nobody to worry about what happened to Aino. It was night. Outside, the sea drummed. Framed by the jagged rock, the sky had faded to brushed charcoal grey, with only the faintest thread of luminescence to distinguish it from the distant ocean. That far-off ocean seemed disconnected from the savage breakers that pounded closer and closer with the incoming tide. Aino slept like a child. The fire was nearly gone. Only a few darting tongues of flame were left to etch the craggy cave roof over Aino's head, shimmering on the flat, closed box between them. Then, as Big Tom held vigil, wiping a covetous hand over his wide lips, these needle flames died, and only the glowing memory of fire remained. He couldn't see Aino. That was bad. Big Tom frowned into the darkness. He needed light to do what he meant to do, just a little light. But there was no more wood left. He didn't want to leave the cave to find any. Aino might wake up. Besides, he wanted to do it now. He wanted to go to sleep tonight knowing that the treasure was all his. He squinted, trying to see Aino lying there in the deep shadows. He couldn't see him, but he saw something. What he saw glowed with a faint luminescent whiteness. It stuck part way out of Aino's shirt. Big Tom grinned. It was the piece of drift they had found that morning, the one that had gotten Aino all worked up, the chunk of wood that had earned Aino his beating. Big Tom grinned wider, remembering how Aino had humbled himself before it. What a fool he was. Big Tom had forgotten all about it until now. The fool must have carried it around with him all day, hidden under his shirt so he wouldn't see it. Now, while Aino slept, it had fallen part way out invitingly. This was rich. Aino thought it had magic in it, that it was a god. Now this god of Aino's was going to light his way to heaven. Big Tom moved like a cat. His hand scuttled over the closed box, then snaked across Aino's pigeon chest and grabbed the piece of drift. Big Tom grinned as he tossed it on the glowing embers. For a minute he crouched by the fire, clenching and unclenching his cold, stiffened fingers for practice. He watched the white piece of drift smolder and smoke. Then a tiny flame sprouted, mirroring twin flames of red murder in his eyes. Outside, the incoming tide drummed louder. Big Tom heard Aino stir and whimper. He turned and prepared himself. Aino's hands were fumbling over his shirt. He was hunting for the piece of drift. When Aino opened his eyes, Big Tom gave a low growl and plunged forward. His blunt fingers closed down on Aino's throat before he could move or scream. His thumbs pressed. It was so easy it wasn't much fun. If only Aino would fight back a little. But he didn't even squirm. He just lay there, his eyes bulging. The pressure on his windpipe made it look as if he was staring behind Big Tom, staring at something that terrified him. Big Tom was almost tempted to turn and see for himself, but he had a job to finish. He pressed harder. Then his fingers loosened, and he let out a scream that echoed from the cave walls and funneled hideously across the sea. Smoke was pouring from the fire behind him. He couldn't see, but the smoke had arms, tentacles, and the tentacles were around his throat, choking him. He couldn't see. He couldn't even see if Aino's eyes were bulging. The smoke was a black pillar, a pillar of whipping snakes. The snakes wrapped themselves around his throat. He screamed and backed away. He fell across the fire, which leaped up hungrily. There wasn't much left of Big Tom. Just some indistinguishable bones. It might seem that some itinerant had camped in this cave for the night, overheated his fire, then overcome by the fumes, had stumbled into the fire and been burned to death. It wasn't too plausible an explanation considering the condition of those bones, but it might suffice. Or were they human bones after all? Ino looked gravely down at the charred mess for a long moment, then carefully fished under it for the piece of drift. It came out white and whole as ever, as cool and smooth to his touch as fine silk. Ino caressed it with reverence. He bowed his head to it and put it back under his shirt, his face luminous with humble pride. He turned. Oh yes, the box. He nudged open the lid with his foot. A wry smile touched his lips as he looked down at a tangled mass of rocks, mud and feline bones. Some imaginative youngster had given his dead cat a sea burial. Ino faced the drumming tide. He squared his thin shoulders and stepped out of the cave. He walked rapidly down the lonely beach. Born to serve, Ino had found a new master. End of Skydrift by Emil Petaja. Doom of the House of Duryea by Earl Peirce. Weird Tales, October 1936. A powerful story of stark horror and the dreadful thing that happened in a lone house in the Maine woods. Arthur Duryea, a young, handsome man, came to meet his father for the first time in 20 years. As he strode into the hotel lobby, long strides which had the spring of elastic in them, idle eyes lifted to appraise him, for he was an impressive figure, somehow grim with exaltation. The desk clerk looked up with his habitual smile of expectation. "How do you do, Mr. So-and-so?" and his fingers strayed to the green fountain pen which stood in a holder on the desk. Arthur Duryea cleared his throat, but still his voice was clogged and unsteady. To the clerk he said, "I'm looking for my father, Dr. Henry Duryea. I understand he's registered here. He has recently arrived from Paris." The clerk lowered his glance to a list of names. "Dr. Duryea is in suite 606th floor." He looked up, his eyebrows arched questioningly. "Are you staying too, sir, Mr. Duryea?" Arthur took the pen and scribbled his name rapidly. Without a further word, neglecting even to get his key and own room number, he turned and walked to the elevators. Not until he reached his father's suite on the 6th floor did he make an audible noise, and this was a mere sigh which fell from his lips like a prayer. The man who opened the door was unusually tall, his slender frame clothed in tight-fitting black. He hardly dared to smile. His clean-shaven face was pale, an almost livid whiteness against the sparkle in his eyes. His jaw had a bluish luster. "Arthur!" The word was scarcely a whisper. It seemed choked up quietly, as if it had been repeated time and again on his thin lips. Arthur Duryea felt the kindliness of those eyes go through him, and then he was in his father's embrace. Later, when these two grown men had regained their outer calm, they closed the door and went into the drawing room. The elder Duryea held out a humidor of fine cigars, and his hand shook so hard when he held the match that his son was forced to cup his own hands about the flame. They both had tears in their eyes, but their eyes were smiling. Henry Duryea placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is the happiest day of my life," he said. "You can never know how much I have longed for this moment." Arthur, looking into that glance, realized with growing pride that he had loved his father all his life, despite any of those things which had been cursed against him. He sat down on the edge of a chair. I don't know how to act," he confessed. "You surprise me, Dad. You're so different from what I had expected." An old, somewhat emaciated man lies in bed, tied by the upper arms to the headboard. A younger man in a dressing gown stands behind the bed, recoiling with one arm over his mouth. An avian or bat-like shadow is cast behind the pair. A cloud came over Dr. Duryea's features. "What did you expect, Arthur?" he demanded quickly. "An evil eye, a shaven head and knotted jowls." "Please, Dad, no." Arthur's words clipped short. "I don't think I ever really visualized you. I knew you would be a splendid man, but I thought you'd look older, more like a man who has really suffered. I have suffered, more than I can ever describe, but seeing you again, and the prospect of spending the rest of my life with you, has more than compensated for my sorrows. Even during the 20 years we were apart, I found an ironic joy in learning of your progress in college and in your American game of football. Then you've been following my work. Yes, Arthur. I've received monthly reports ever since you left me. From my study in Paris, I've been really close to you, working out your problems as if they were my own. And now that the 20 years are completed, the ban which kept us apart is lifted forever. From now on, son, we shall be the closest of companions, unless your Aunt Cecilia has succeeded in her terrible mission. The mention of that name caused an unfamiliar chill to come between the two men. It stood for something in each of them which gnawed their minds like a malignancy. But to the younger Duryea, in his intense effort to forget the awful past, her name as well as her madness must be forgotten. He had no wish to carry on this subject of conversation, for it betrayed an internal weakness which he hated. With forced determination and a ludicrous lift of his eyebrows, he said, "Cecilia is dead, and her silly superstition is dead also. From now on, Dad, we're going to enjoy life as we should. Bygones are really bygones in this case." Dr. Duryea closed his eyes slowly, as though an exquisite pain had gone through him. "Then you have no indignation?" he questioned. "You have none of your aunt's hatred?" "Indignation, hatred." Arthur laughed aloud. "Ever since I was 12 years old, I have disbelieved Cecilia's stories. I have known that those horrible things were impossible, that they belonged to the ancient category of mythology and tradition. How, then, can I be indignant, and how can I hate you? How can I do anything but recognize Cecilia for what she was, a mean, frustrated woman, cursed with an insane grudge against you and your family? I tell you, Dad, that nothing she has ever said can possibly come between us again." Henry Duryea nodded his head. His lips were tight together, and the muscles in his throat held back a cry. In that same soft tone of defense, he spoke further, doubting words. "Are you so sure of your subconscious mind, Arthur? Can you be so certain that you are free from all suspicion, however vague? Is there not a lingering premonition, a premonition which warns of peril?" "No, Dad, no!" Arthur shot to his feet. "I don't believe it. I've never believed it. I know, as any sane man would know, that you are neither a vampire nor a murderer. You know it too, and Cecilia knew it, only she was mad. That family rot is dispelled, Father. This is a civilized century. Belief in vampirism is sheer lunacy. Why, it's too absurd even to think about." "You have the enthusiasm of youth," said his father in a rather tired voice. "But have you not heard the legend?" Arthur stepped back instinctively. He moistened his lips, for their dryness might crack them. "The legend?" He said the word in a curious hush of awed softness, as he had heard his Aunt Cecilia say it many times before. "That awful legend that I eat my children?" "Oh God, Father!" Arthur went to his knees as a cry burst through his lips. "Dad, that's ghastly. We must forget Cecilia's ravings." "You are affected, then?" asked Dr. Duryea bitterly. "Affected? Certainly I'm affected, but only as I should be at such an accusation. Cecilia was mad, I tell you. Those books she showed me years ago, and those folk tales of vampires and ghouls, they burned into my infantile mind like acid. They haunted me day and night in my youth, and caused me to hate you worse than death itself. But in heaven's name, Father, I've outgrown those things as I have outgrown my clothes. I'm a man now, do you understand that? A man with a man's sense of logic." "Yes, I understand." Henry Duryea threw his cigar into the fireplace and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We shall forget Cecilia," he said. "As I told you in my letter, I have rented a lodge in Maine, where we can go to be alone for the rest of the summer. We'll get in some fishing and hiking and perhaps some hunting. But first, Arthur, I must be sure in my own mind that you are sure in yours. I must be sure you won't bar your door against me at night and sleep with a loaded revolver at your elbow. I must be sure that you're not afraid of going up there alone with me and dying." His voice ended abruptly, as if an age-long dread had taken hold of it. His son's face was waxen, with sweat standing out like pearls on his brow. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with questions which his lips could not put into words. His own hand touched his father's and tightened over it. Henry Duryea drew his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said, and his eyes looked straight over Arthur's lowered head. "This thing must be thrashed out now. I believe you when you say that you discredit Cecilia's stories, but for a sake greater than sanity I must tell you the truth behind the legend, and believe me, Arthur, there is a truth." He climbed to his feet and walked to the window which looked out over the street below. For a moment, he gazed into space, silent. Then he turned and looked down at his son. "You have heard only your aunt's version of the legend, Arthur. Doubtless it was warped into a thing far more hideous than it actually was, if that is possible. Doubtless she spoke to you of the inquisitorial stake in Carcassonne, where one of my ancestors perished. Also, she may have mentioned that book Vampires, which a former Duryea is supposed to have written. Then certainly she told you about your two younger brothers, my own poor, motherless children, who were sucked bloodless in their cradles." Arthur Duryea passed a hand across his aching eyes. Those words, so often repeated by that witch of an aunt, stirred up the same visions which had made his childhood nights sleepless with terror. He could hardly bear to hear them again, and from the very man to whom they were accredited. "Listen, Arthur," the elder Duryea went on quickly, his voice low with the pain it gave him. "You must know that true basis to your aunt's hatred. You must know of that curse of vampirism which is supposed to have followed the Duryeas through 5 centuries of French history, but which we can dispel as pure superstition, so often connected with ancient families. But I must tell you that this part of the legend is true. Your 2 young brothers actually died in their cradles, bloodless. And I stood trial in France for their murder, and my name was smirched throughout all of Europe with such an inhuman damnation that it drove your aunt and you to America, and has left me childless, hated, and ostracized from society the world over. I must tell you that on that terrible night in Duryea Castle, I had been working late on historic volumes of Crespit and Prynne, and on that loathsome tome, Vampires. I must tell you of the soreness that was in my throat, and of the heaviness of the blood which coursed through my veins, and of that presence which was neither man nor animal, but which I knew was someplace near me, yet neither within the castle nor outside of it, and which was closer to me than my heart, and more terrible to me than the touch of the grave. I was at the desk in my library, my head swimming in a delirium which left me senseless until dawn. There were nightmares that frightened me, Arthur, a grown man who had dissected countless cadavers in morgues and medical schools. I know that my tongue was swollen in my mouth, and that brine moistened my lips, and that a rottenness pervaded my body like a fever. I can make no recollection of sanity or of consciousness. That night remains vivid, unforgettable, yet somehow completely in shadows. When I had fallen asleep, if in God's name it was sleep, I was slumped across my desk. But when I awoke in the morning, I was lying face down on my couch. So you see, Arthur, I had moved during that night, and I had never known it. What I'd done and where I'd gone during those dark hours will always remain an impenetrable mystery. But I do know this. On the morrow I was torn from my sleep by the shrieks of maids and butlers, and by that mad wailing of your aunt. I stumbled through the open door of my study, and in the nursery I saw those 2 babies there, lifeless, white and dry like mummies, and with twin holes in their necks that were caked black with their own blood. "Oh, I don't blame you for your incredulousness, Arthur. I cannot believe it yet myself, nor shall I ever believe it. The belief of it would drive me to suicide, and still the doubting of it drives me mad with horror." All of France was doubtful, and even the savants who defended my name at the trial found that they could not explain it, nor disbelieve it. The case was quieted by the Republic, for it might have shaken science to its very foundation and split the pedestals of religion and logic. I was released from the charge of murder, but the actual murder has hung about me like a stench. The coroners who examined those tiny cadavers found them both dry of all their blood, but could find no blood on the floor of the nursery nor in the cradles. Something from hell stalked the halls of Duryea that night, and I should blow my brains out if I dared to think deeply of who that was. You too, my son, would have been dead and bloodless if you hadn't been sleeping in a separate room with your door barred on the inside. You were a timid child, Arthur. You were only 7 years old, but you were filled with the folklore of those mad Lombards and the decadent poetry of your aunt. On that same night, while I was someplace between heaven and hell, you also heard the padded footsteps on the stone corridor and heard the tugging at your door handle. For in the morning you complained of a chill and of terrible nightmares which frightened you in your sleep. I only thank God that your door was barred." Henry Duryea's voice choked into a sob, which brought the stinging tears back into his eyes. He paused to wipe his face, and to dig his fingers into his palm. "You understand, Arthur, that for 20 years, under my sworn oath at the Palace of Justice, I could neither see you nor write to you. 20 years, my son, while all of that time you had grown to hate me and to spit at my name. Not until your aunt's death have you called yourself a Duryea. And now you come to me at my bidding and say you love me as a son should love his father. Perhaps it is God's forgiveness for everything. Now at last we shall be together, and that terrible, unexplainable past will be buried forever." He put his handkerchief back into his pocket and walked slowly to his son. He dropped to one knee and his hands gripped Arthur's arms. "My son, I can say no more to you. I have told you the truth as I alone know it. I may be, by all accounts, some ghoulish creation of Satan on earth. I may be a child killer, a vampire, some morbidly diseased specimen of Recolakas, things which science cannot explain. Perhaps the dreaded legend of the Duryeas is true. Ottiel Duryea was convicted of murdering his brother in that same monstrous fashion in the year 1576, and he died in Barnes at the stake. François Duryea, in 1802, blew his head apart with a blunderbuss on the morning after his youngest son was found dead, apparently from anemia. And there are others, of whom I cannot bear to speak, that would chill your soul if you were to hear them. So you see, Arthur, there is a hellish tradition behind our family. There is a heritage which no sane God would ever have allowed. The future of the Duryeas lies in you, for you are the last of thy race. I pray with all of my heart that Providence will permit you to live your full share of years, and to leave other Duryeas behind you. And so if ever again I feel that presence as I did in Duryea Castle, I am going to die as François Duryea died over 100 years ago." He stood up, and his son stood up at his side. "If you are willing to forget, Arthur, we shall go up to that lodge in Maine. There is a life we've never known awaiting us. We must find that life, and we must find the happiness which a curious fate snatched from us on those Lombard sourlands 20 years ago." Chapter 2. Henry Duryea's tall stature, coupled with a slenderness of frame and a sleekness of muscle, gave him an appearance that was unusually gaunt. His son couldn't help but think of that word as he sat on the rustic porch of the lodge, watching his father sunning himself at the lake's edge. Henry Duryea had a kindliness in his face, at times an almost sublime kindliness which great prophets often possess. But when his face was partly in shadows, particularly about his brow, There was a frightening tone which came into his features, for it was a tone of farness, of mysticism and conjuration. Somehow, in the late evenings, he assumed the unapproachable mantle of a dreamer and sat silently before the fire, his mind ever off in unknown places. In that little lodge there was no electricity, and the glow of the oil lamps played curious tricks with the human expression which frequently resulted in something unhuman. It may have been the dusk of night, the flickering of the lamps, but Arthur Duryea had certainly noticed how his father's eyes had sunken further into his head, and how his cheeks were tighter, and the outline of his teeth pressed into the skin about his lips. It was nearing sundown on the second day of their stay at Timber Lake. 6 miles away the dirt road wound on toward Houtlon, near the Canadian border. So it was lonely there, on a solitary little lake hemmed in closely with dark evergreens and a sky which drooped low over dusty summited mountains. Within the lodge was a homey fireplace and a glossy elk's head which peered out above the mantel. There were guns and fishing tackle on the walls, shelves of reliable American fiction, Mark Twain, Melville, Stockton, and a well-worn edition of Bret Harte. A fully supplied kitchen and a wood stove furnished them with hearty meals which were welcome after a whole day's tramp in the woods. On that evening, Henry Duryea prepared a select French stew out of every available vegetable and a can of soup. They ate well, then stretched out before the fire for a smoke. They were outlining a trip to the Orient together when the back door blew open with a terrific bang, and a wind swept into the lodge with a coldness which chilled them both. "A storm," Henry Duryea said, rising to his feet. "Sometimes they have them up here, and they're pretty bad. The roof might leak over your bedroom. Perhaps you'd like to sleep down here with me." His fingers strayed playfully over his son's head as he went out into the kitchen to bar the swinging door. Arthur's room was upstairs, next to a spare room filled with extra furniture. He'd chosen it because he liked the altitude, and because the only other bedroom was occupied. He went upstairs swiftly and silently. His roof didn't leak. It was absurd even to think it might. It had been his father again, suggesting that they sleep together. He had done it before, in a jesting, whispering way, as if to challenge them both if they dared to sleep together. Arthur came back downstairs, dressed in his bathrobe and slippers. He stood on the 5th stair, rubbing a 2 days' growth of beard. "I think I'll shave tonight," he said to his father. "May I use your razor?" Henry Duryea, draped in a black raincoat and with his face haloed in the brim of a rain hat, looked up from the hall. A frown glided obscurely from his features. "Not at all, son. Sleeping upstairs?" Arthur nodded and quickly said, "Are you going out?" "Yes, I'm going to tie the boats up tighter. I'm afraid the lake will rough it up a bit." Duryea jerked back the door and stepped outside. The door slammed shut, and his footsteps sounded on the wood flooring of the porch. Arthur came slowly down the remaining steps. He saw his father's figure pass across the dark rectangle of a window, saw the flash of lightning that suddenly printed his grim silhouette against the glass. He sighed deeply, a sigh which burned in his throat, for his throat was sore and aching. Then he went into the bedroom, found the razor lying in plain view on a birch tabletop. As he reached for it, his glance fell upon his father's open Gladstone bag, which rested at the foot of the bed. There was a book resting there, half hidden by a grey flannel shirt. It was a narrow, yellow-bound book, oddly out of place. Frowning, he bent down and lifted it from the bag. It was surprisingly heavy in his hands, and he noticed a faintly sickening odour of decay which drifted from it like a perfume. The title of the volume had been thumbed away into an indecipherable blur of gold letters. But pasted across the front cover was a white strip of paper, on which was typewritten the word Infantifugæ. He flipped back the cover and ran his eyes over the title page. The book was printed in French, an early French, yet to him wholly comprehensible. The publication date was 1580 in Cannes. Breathlessly, he turned back a second page, saw a chapter headed Vampires. He slumped to one elbow across the bed. His eyes were 4 inches from those mildewed pages. His nostrils reeked with the stench of them. He skipped long paragraphs of pedantic jargon on theology. He scanned brief accounts of strange, blood-eating monsters, vrykolaques and leprechauns. He read of Jeanne d'Arc, of Ludwig Prynne, and muttered aloud the Latin snatches from Episcopi. He passed pages in quick succession, his fingers shaking with the fear of it and his eyes hanging heavily in their sockets. He saw vague reference to Enoch and saw the terrible drawings by an ancient Dominican of Rome. Paragraph after paragraph he read, the horror-striking testimony of Nida's anthill, the testimony of people who died shrieking at the stake, the recitals of grave tenders, of jurists and hangmen. Then unexpectedly, among all of this monumental vestige, there appeared before his eyes the name of Duryea, and he stopped reading as though invisibly struck. Thunder clapped near the lodge and rattled the window panes. The deep rolling of bursting clouds echoed over the valley, but he heard none of it. His eyes were on those 2 short sentences which his father, someone, had underlined with dark red crayon. The execution 4 years ago of Duryea does not end the Duryea controversy. Time alone can decide whether the demon has claimed that family from its beginning to its end. Arthur read on about the trial of Duryea before Veneti, the Carcassonnean Inquisitor General, read with mounting horror. The evidence which had sent that far-gone Duryea to the pillar, the evidence of a bloodless corpse who had been Duryea's young brother. Unmindful now of the tremendous storm which had centered over Timber Lake, unheeding the clatter of windows and the swish of pines on the roof, even of his father who worked down at the lake's edge in a drenching rain. Arthur fastened his glance to the blurred print of those pages, sinking deeper and deeper into the garbled legends of a dark age. On the last page of the chapter, he again saw the name of his ancestor, Duryea. He traced a shaking finger over the narrow lines of words, and when he finished reading them, he rolled sideways on the bed, and from his lips came a sobbing, mumbling prayer. God, O God in heaven, protect me. For he had read, as in the case of Duryea, we observe that this specimen of Vrykolakas preys only upon the blood in its own family. It possesses none of the characteristics of the undead vampire, being usually a living male person of otherwise normal appearances, unsuspecting its inherent demonism. But this Vrykolakas cannot act according to its demoniacal possession unless it is in the presence of a second member of the same family, who acts as a medium between the man and its demon. This medium has none of the traits of the vampire, but it senses the being of this creature when the metamorphosis is about to occur by reason of intense pains in the head and throat. Both the vampire and the medium undergo similar reactions, involving nausea, nocturnal visions, and physical disquietude. When these 2 outcasts are within a certain distance of each other, the coalescence of inherent demonism is completed, and the vampire is subject to its attacks, demanding blood for its sustenance. No member of the family is safe at these times, for the Vrykolakas, acting in its true agency on earth, will unerringly seek out the blood. In rare cases, where other victims are unavailable, the vampire will even take the blood from the very medium which made it possible. This vampire is born into certain aged families, and naught but death can destroy it. It is not conscious of its blood madness, and acts only in a psychic state. The medium, also, is unaware of its terrible role, and when these 2 are together, despite any lapse of years, the fusion of inheritance is so violent that no power known on earth can turn it back. Chapter 3. The lodge door slammed shut with a sudden, interrupting bang. The load grated, and Henry Duryea's footsteps sounded on the planked floor. Arthur shook himself from the bed. He had only time to fling that haunting book into the Gladstone bag before he sensed his father standing in the doorway. You're not shaving, Arthur." Duryea's words, spliced hesitantly, were toneless. He glanced from the tabletop to the Gladstone and to his son. He said nothing for a moment, his glance inscrutable. Then, "It's blowing up quite a storm outside." Arthur swallowed the first words which had come into his throat, nodded quickly. "Yes, isn't it? Quite a storm." He met his father's gaze, his face burning. I don't think I'll shave, Dad. My head aches." Duryea came swiftly into the room and pinned Arthur's arms in his grasp. "What do you mean your head aches?" "How? Does your throat?" "No." Arthur jerked himself away. He laughed. "It's that French stew of yours. It's hit me in the stomach." He stepped past his father and started up the stairs. "The stew?" Duryea pivoted on his heel. "Possibly. I think I feel it myself." Arthur stopped, his face suddenly white. "You too?" The words were hardly audible. Their glances met, clashed like dueling swords. For 10 seconds neither of them said a word or moved a muscle. Arthur from the stairs, looking down, his father below, gazing up at him. In Henry Duryea, the blood drained slowly from his face and left a purple etching across the bridge of his nose and above his eyes. He looked like a death's head. Arthur winced at the sight and twisted his eyes away. He turned to go up the remaining stairs. "Son!" He stopped again, his hand tightened on the banister. "Yes, Dad." Duryea put his foot on the first stair. "I want you to lock your door tonight. The wind would keep it banging." "Yes," breathed Arthur, and pushed up the stairs to his room. Dr. Duryea's hollow footsteps sounded in steady, unhesitant beats across the floor of Timber Lake Lodge. Sometimes they stopped, and the crackling hiss of a sulphur match took their place, then perhaps a distended sigh, and again footsteps. Arthur crouched at the open door of his room. His head was cocked for those noises from below. In his hands was a double-barrel shotgun of violent gauge. Thud, thud, thud. Then a pause, the clinking of a glass and the gurgling of liquid. The sigh, the tread of his feet over the floor. He's thirsty, Arthur thought, thirsty. Outside the storm had grown into fury. Lightning zigzagged between the mountains, filling the valley with weird phosphorescence. Thunder, like drums, rolled incessantly. Within the lodge, the heat of the fireplace piled the atmosphere thick with stagnation. All the doors and windows were locked shut. The oil lamps glowed weakly, a pale, anemic light. Henry Duryea walked to the foot of the stairs and stood looking up. Arthur sensed his movements and ducked back into his room, the gun gripped in his shaking fingers. Then Henry Duryea's footsteps sounded on the first stair. Arthur slumped to one knee. He buckled a fist against his teeth as a prayer tumbled through them. Duryea climbed a second step, and another, and still one more. On the fourth stair he stopped. "Arthur!" His voice cut into the silence like the crack of a whip. "Arthur, will you come down here?" "Yes, Dad." Bedraggled, his body hanging like cloth, young Duryea took 5 steps to the landing. "We can't be zanies," cried Henry Duryea. "My soul is sick with dread. Tomorrow we're going back to New York. I'm going to get the first boat to open sea. Please come down here." He turned about and descended the stairs to his room. Arthur choked back the words which had lumped in his mouth. Half dazed, he followed. In the bedroom, he saw his father stretched face up along the bed. He saw a pile of rope at his father's feet. "Tie me to the bedposts, Arthur," came the command. "Tie both my hands and both my feet." Arthur stood gaping. "Do as I tell you." "Dad, what whore? Don't be a fool. You read that book. You know what relation you are to me. I'd always hoped it was Cecilia, but now I know it's you. I should have known it on that night 20 years ago when you complained of a headache and nightmares." Quickly, my head rocks with pain. Tie me." Speechless, his own pain piercing him with agony, Arthur fell to that grisly task. Both hands he tied, and both feet. Tied them so firmly to the iron posts that his father could not lift himself an inch off the bed. Then he blew out the lamps, and without a further glance at that Prometheus, he reascended the stairs to his room and slammed and locked his door behind him. He looked once at the breech of his gun and set it against a chair by his bed. He flung off his robe and slippers, and within 5 minutes he was senseless in slumber. Chapter 4. He slept late, and when he awakened, his muscles were as stiff as boards, and the lingering visions of a nightmare clung before his eyes. He pushed his way out of bed, stood dazedly on the floor. A dull, numbing cruciation circulated through his head. He felt bloated, coarse, and running with internal mucus. His mouth was dry, his gums sore and stinging. He tightened his hands as he lunged for the door. "Dad!" he cried, and he heard his voice breaking in his throat. Sunlight filtered through the window at the top of the stairs. The air was hot and dry and carried in it a mild odor of decay. Arthur suddenly drew back at that odor, drew back with a gasp of awful fear. For he recognized it, that stench, the heaviness of his blood, the rawness of his tongue and gums. Age-long it seemed, yet rising like a spirit in his memory. All of these things he had known and felt before. He leaned against the banister, and half slid, half stumbled down the stairs. His father had died during the night. He lay like a waxen figure tied to his bed, his face done up in knots. Arthur stood dumbly at the foot of the bed for only a few seconds. Then he went back upstairs to his room. Almost immediately, he emptied both barrels of the shotgun into his head. The tragedy at Timber Lake was discovered accidentally 3 days later. A party of fishermen, upon finding the 2 bodies, notified state authorities, and an investigation was directly underway. Arthur Duryea had undoubtedly met death at his own hands. The condition of his wounds, and the manner with which he held the lethal weapon, at once foreclosed the suspicion of any foul play. But the death of Dr. Henry Duryea confronted the police with an inexplicable mystery, for his trussed-up body, unscathed except for 2 jagged holes over the jugular vein, had been drained of all its blood. The autopsy protocol of Henry Duryea laid death to undetermined causes, and it was not until the yellow tabloids commenced an investigation into the Duryea family history that the incredible and fantastic explanations were offered to the public. Obviously, such talk was held in popular contempt, yet in view of the controversial war which followed, the authorities considered it expedient to consign both Duryeas to the crematory. End of Doom of the House of Duryea by Earl Peirce. Out of the Jar by Charles R. Tanner, author of Tumithak of the Corridors and Flight of the Mercury. Stirring Science Stories, February 1941. I am presenting here, at the insistence of my friend, James Francis Denning, an account of an event or series of events which, he says, occurred to him during the late summer and early fall of 1940. I do so not because I concur in the hope which Denning has that it may arouse serious investigation of the phenomena he claims took place, but merely that a statement of those phenomena may be placed on record. As a case history for future students of occult phenomena, or psychology, personally, I am still unpersuaded under which head this narration should be placed. Were RNY mind one of those which accepts witches, vampires, and werewolves in the general scheme of things? I would not doubt for a moment the truth of Denning's tale, for certainly the man believes it himself. and his lack of imagination and matter-of-fact mode of living up until the time of the occurrence speak strongly in his favor. And then, too, there is the mental breakdown of the brilliant young Edward Barnes Halpin as added evidence. This young student of occult history and the vague lesser-known cults and religions was a fairly close acquaintance of Denning's for years, and it was at Denning's home that he suffered the stroke which made him the listless, stricken thing that he is today. That much is fact, and can be attested to by any number of people. As to Denning's explanation, I can only say that it deserves a thorough investigation. If there is any truth in it at all, the truth should certainly be verified and recorded. And so, to the story. It began, Denning says, in the summer of last year, when he attended a sale disposing of the stock of one of those little second-hand stores that call themselves antique shops and are known to most people as junk shops. There was the usual hodgepodge of Indian curios, glassware, Victorian furniture and old books, and Denning attended it as he did every event of this kind, allowing himself to indulge in the single vice which he had, that of filling his home with a stock of cheap and useless curios from all parts of the world. At this particular sale, he emerged triumphantly with a carved elephant tusk, an Alaskan medicine man's mask, and an earthenware jar. This jar was a rather ordinary thing, round-bodied, with a very short cylindrical neck, and with a glazed band around its center, blue glaze, with curious angular characters in yellow that even the rather illiterate Denning could see bore a certain relation to Greek characters. The auctioneer called it very old, said it was Syriac or Samaritan, and called attention to the seal which was affixed to the lid. This lid was of earthenware similar to the jar, and was set in the mouth after the manner of a cork, and a filling of what seemed to be hard-baked clay sealed it in. And on this baked clay, or whatever it was, had been stamped a peculiar design, 2 triangles interwoven to form a 6-pointed star, with 3 unknown characters in the center. Although the auctioneer was as ignorant as Denning as to the real significance of this seal, he made a mystery of it, and Denning was hooked. He bought the thing and brought it home, where it found a place, in spite of his wife's objections, on the mantel in the living room. And here it rested, in a questionable obscurity, for a matter of 4 or 5 months. I say questionable obscurity, for as near as I can gather it was the bone of contention during most of that time, between Denning and his wife. It was but natural, I think, that this estimable lady should object to having the best room in their little home filled with what were to her a mass of useless objects. Yet nothing was done about it. In the light of Denning's story of subsequent events, it seems almost incredible that that frightful thing could sit there day after day in that commonplace living room, being taken down and dusted now and then, and carelessly placed back. Yet such was the case, and such remained the case until the first visit of young Halpin. This young man was an acquaintance of Denning's of long standing, and their friendship had been slowly ripening during the last year. Owing to the fact that Halpin was able to add much to Denning's knowledge of the curios which he accumulated, both of them worked for the same company, and, seeing each other every day, it was not unusual that they had become quite friendly, in spite of the fact that neither had ever visited the other's home. But Denning's description of certain carvings on the elephant's tusk, which he had bought, interested young Halpin sufficiently to cause him to pay a visit to Denning's home to make a personal examination of the tusk. Halpin, at this time, was still under 30, yet he had become already a recognized authority in this country of that queer borderland of mystic occult study that Churchward fought. Lovecraft and the Miskatonic school represent. His articles on some of the obscure chapters of Derlet's Culte Ghoul has been accepted favorably by American occult students, as well as his translation of the hitherto expurgated sections of the Gaelic Lebha Mordu. In all, he was a most promising student, and one in whom the traits of what now seem to have been incipient dementia praecox were conspicuous by their absence. Indeed, one of his strongest characteristics, Denning tells me, was a pronounced interest in almost everything about him. He was like that, the night that he first visited me, says Denning. He looked over the tusk, explained all the curious carvings that he could, and made little sketches of the remaining figures to take away and study. Then his eyes began roving about the room, and pretty soon they noticed some other little thing, I don't remember just what, and he began talking about that. I had a couple of fulsome points, those curious flints that are supposed to be much older than any other American artifacts, and he spoke about them for nearly 20 minutes. Then he laid them down and was up and around the room again, and presently he picked up something else and was talking about that. I used to learn an awful lot from Ed Halpin, but I think I learned more that night than I ever did at any other one time. And at last his eyes lit on that jar. Yes, his eyes lit on the jar, and started the series of happenings that at last made this story necessary. For Halpin was stricken with a sudden curiosity, picked up the jar and glanced over it, and then suddenly became wildly excited. "Why, it's old," he ejaculated. "It's ancient Hebrew, Jim. Where in the world did you get it?" Denning told him, but his curiosity was unappeased. He spent several minutes trying to extract from Denning a knowledge which it became obvious that the latter did not possess. It was easy to see that Halpin already knew more concerning the jar than did Denning, and so his questions ceased. "But surely you know what it is supposed to be, don't you?" quizzed Halpin. "Didn't the auctioneer tell you anything about it? Didn't you see the previous owner?" "Lord Denning, how can you find interest in these things if you don't learn all you can of them?" Denning was rendered apologetic by his evident exasperation, and Halpin suddenly relented, laughed, and started to explain. "That six-pointed star, Jim, is known as Solomon's seal. It has been a potent sign used in Hebraic Kabbalah for thousands of years. What has me interested is its use in connection with Phoenician characters around the body of the vase. That seems to indicate a real antiquity. It might just be possible that this is actually the seal of Solomon himself. Jim," his attitude suddenly changed. "Jim, sell me this thing, will you?" Now it seems incredible that Denning saw no slightest gleam of light in this guarded explanation of Halpin's. The young student certainly was aware of much of the importance of the jar, but Denning insists that the explanation meant nothing whatever to him. To be sure, Denning was no student. He had probably never heard of the Kabbalah, nor of Abdul al-Hazid or Joachim of Cordoba, but surely in his youth he had read the Arabian Nights. Even that should have given him a clue. Apparently not. He tells me that he refused Halpin's offer to buy the vase, simply because of a collector's vagary. He felt that, well, to use his own words, if it was worth $10 to him, it was worth $10 to me. And so, though Halpin increased the offer which he first made, Denning was obdurate. Halpin left with merely an invitation to come back at any time and examine the vase to his heart's content. During the next 3 weeks, Halpin did return several times. He copied down the inscription on the blue band, made a wax impression of the seal, photographed the vase, and even went so far as to measure it and weigh it. And all the time his interest increased and his bids for the thing rose higher. At last, unable to raise his offer further, he was reduced to pleading with Denning that he sell it, and at this, Denning grew angry. "I told him," says Denning, "I told him that I was getting sick and tired of his begging. I said I wasn't going to sell it to him, and that even if it cost me our friendship, that vase was going to stay mine." Then he started on another line. He wanted to open it and see what was inside. But I had a good excuse for not complying with that plea. He himself had told me of the interest that attached to the seal on the clay, and I wasn't going to have that broken if I knew myself. I was so positive on this score that he gave in and apologized again. At least I thought he gave in. I know different now, of course. We all know different now. Halpin had decided to open the vase at any cost, and so had merely given up the idea of trying to buy it. We must not think, however, that he had been reduced to the status of a common thief in spite of his later actions. The young man's attitude was explainable to anyone who can understand the viewpoint of a student of science. Here was an opportunity to study one of the most perplexing problems of occult art, and obstinacy, combined with ignorance, was trying to prevent it. He determined to circumvent Denning, no matter to what depths he had to stoop. Thus it was that several nights later Jim Denning was awakened, sometime during the early morning hours, by a slight, unusual noise on the lower floor of his home. At first but half awake, he lay and listlessly pondered the situation. Had his wife awakened and gone downstairs for a midnight snack? Or had he heard perhaps a mouse in the kitchen? Could it be? A sleeping sigh from his wife's bed made him realize that it wasn't she, and at the same moment came a repetition of the sound, a dull clunk as of metal, striking muffled metal. Instantly alert, he rose from his pillow, stepped out of bed, fumbled for robe and slippers, and was tiptoeing down the steps, stopping only long enough to get his revolver from the drawer in which he kept it. From the landing he could see a dim light in the living room, and again he heard the clunk that he had heard before. By leaning far over the banister, he was able to look into the living room where he could see, by the light of a flashlight lying on the floor, the dark form of a man, his long overcoat and hat effectively concealing all his features. He was stooping over a round object, and as Denning looked, he raised a hammer and brought it down sharply but carefully on a chisel which he held in his hand. The hammer's head was wrapped in rags, and again Denning heard the dull noise which had awakened him. Of course, Denning knew at once who the dark form was. He knew that the round object was his vase, but he hesitated to make an outcry or even to interrupt the other for several seconds. He seemed a little uncertain as to the reason for this, but I am convinced, from what I know of Denning's character, that curiosity had gotten the better of him. Half-consciously, he was determined to find out just why Halpin was so interested in the vase, so he remained silent, and it was only after several seconds that some slight noise he made caused Halpin to turn in a panic. As he did so, the last bit of seal crumbled from the jar, and rising, he still clung unconsciously to the lid. The jar turned over on its side and lay there for a moment unnoticed. Halpin was almost horror-stricken at the realization that he had been caught, as the lawyers say, in flagrante delicto. He burst into chattering, pleading speech. "Don't call the police, Jim. Listen to me. I wasn't going to steal it, Jim. I'd have been gone with it long ago if I had intended to steal it. Honest. Let me tell you, Jim, it's one of Solomon's jars, all right. I was only going to open it." "Good Lord, man. Haven't you ever read about them? Listen, Jim, haven't you ever heard those old Arabian legends? Let me tell you about them, Jim." As he spoke, Denning had descended the stairs. He stepped into the room and seized Halpin by the shoulders and angrily shook him. "Quit babbling, Halpin. Don't act like a damned fool. I guess the jar and its contents are still mine. Come on, snap out of it and tell me what this is all about." Halpin swallowed his panic and sighed. "There are old Arabian and Hebrew legends, Jim, that speak of a group or class of beings called jinn. A lot of the stuff about them is claptrap, of course, but as near as we can make out, they rear a kind of super being from some other plane of existence. Probably they were the same things that other legends have called the Elder Ones or the Pre-Adamites. Perhaps there are a dozen names for them if they are the same beings that appear in myths of other countries. Before the time of man, they ruled the world, but fighting among themselves and certain conditions during the glacial period caused them to become almost extinct, here on this earth. But the few that were left caused damage enough among men until the time of King Solomon. Arabian legend says that Solomon was the greatest of all kings, and from an occult standing I guess he was, in spite of the fact that the kingdom he ruled over was little more than a jerkwater principality, even in that age. But Solomon's occult knowledge was great enough to enable him to war on the jinn and to conquer them. And then, because it was impossible to kill them, their metabolism is entirely different from ours. He sealed them up into jars and cast the jars into the depths of the sea. Denning was still dense. Halpin, you're not trying to tell me that you expect to find a djinn in that jar, are you? You're not such a superstitious fool as to believe. Jim, I don't know what I believe. There's no record of such a jar as this having ever been found before. But I know that the elder ones once existed, and from an examination of that jar an occult might learn much concerning. While Halpin had been speaking, Denning's eye had fallen on the jar, lying where it had tumbled at Halpin's sudden rising, and the hair on Denning's neck quivered with a wave of horripilation as he stammered suddenly, "For the love of God, Halpin, look at that jar." Halpin's eyes turned at Denning's first words, and he too stared, unable to take his eyes off the thing that was taking place. From the mouth of the jar was flowing, slowly, sluggishly, a thick, viscous mass of bluish, faintly luminous stuff. The mass was spreading, oozing across the floor, reaching curious, curdly pseudopods out in all directions, acting not like an inert, viscous body should, but like an amoeba under a microscope. And from it, as though it were highly volatile, curled little streamers of heavy smoke or vapor. To their ears came, almost inaudibly at first, and then more and more loudly, a slow, deliberate cluck, cluck, siluak from the mass as it spread. The two had forgotten their differences. Denning stepped toward Halpin and clasped his shoulder fearfully. Halpin stood like a stone statue, but his breath was like that of a winded runner, and they stood there and looked as that incredible jelly spread and steamed across the floor. I think it was the luminous quality of the mass that horrified the men the most. It had a dull bluish glow, a light of a shade that made it absolutely certain that it was not merely a reflection from the light of the flashlight, which still threw its beam in a comet's tail across the floor. And too, it was certain properties in the mist, for that behaved not like a normal mist, but with a sentience of its own. It floated about the room, seeking, and yet it avoided the presence of the two men as though it feared their touch, and it was increasing. It was quite apparent that the mass on the floor was evaporating, passing into the mist, and it was evident that it would soon be gone. Is it one of those things, Halpin?" whispered Denning hoarsely, but Halpin answered him not at all, but only gripped his hand, tighter and tighter and tighter. Then the mist began a slow, twirling motion, and a deep sigh came from Halpin. It seemed that he was assured of something by this, for he leaned over and whispered to Denning with what seemed a certain amount of confidence, "It's one of them, all right. Stand back by the door and let me handle it. I know a little something from the books I've read." Denning backed away, more than a little fearful of Halpin now, seeing that the young man seemed to know something of this terrible thing, but nevertheless grateful for the suggestion. Standing there by the doorway, hoping vaguely that his traitorous legs would obey him if it became necessary to flee, he watched the dread process of materialization take place. And I think he has never quite recovered from the effects of it, for surely, at that moment, the entire philosophy of his life was changed. Denning, I have noticed, goes to church quite regularly now. However, as I say, he stood there and watched the smoke or vapor or whatever it was, whirl and whirl, faster and faster, snatching up the vagrant wisps and streamers that had strayed to the far corners of the room, sucking them in, incorporating them into the central column, until at last that column, swirling there, seemed almost solid. It was solid. It had ceased its whirling and stood there quivering, jelly-like plastic, but nevertheless solid. And, as though molded in the hands of an invisible sculptor, that column was changing. Indentations appeared here, protuberances there. The character of the surface altered subtly, Presently it was no longer smooth and lustrous, but rough and scaly. It lost most of its luminosity and became an uncertain lichenous green, until at last it was a thing. That moment, Denning thinks, was the most horrible in all the adventure, not because of the horror of the thing that stood before him, but because at that very moment, an automobile, driven by some belated citizen, passed by outside, the light from its headlights casting eerie gleams across the walls and the ceiling, and the thought of the difference between the commonplace world in which that citizen was living, and the frightful things taking place in this room, almost overcame the cowering man by the doorway. And too, the light made just that much plainer the disgusting details of the creature that towered above them. For tower it did. It was, apparently about 9 feet tall, for its head quite reached the ceiling of Denning's little room. It was roughly man-like, for it had an erect body and 4 limbs, 2 upper and 2 lower. It had a head and a sort of a face on it, but there its similarity to man ceased. Its head had a high ridge running from the forehead to the nape of the neck, and it had no eyes and no nose. In the place of these organs was a curious thing that looked not unlike the blossom of a sea anemone, and beneath that was a mouth with an upper lip that was like a protruding fleshy beak, making the whole mouth take on the semblance of a sardonic letter. Fifth, the front of its body had the fiat undetailed plainness of a lizard's belly, and the legs were long, scaly, and terribly scrawny. The same might be said of the arms, which terminated in surprisingly delicate, surprisingly human hands. Halpin had been watching the materialization with the eagerness of a hawk, and no sooner was it complete, no sooner did he notice that tautening of the creature's muscles that indicated conscious control. Then he burst out with a jumble of strange words. Now, it happens that Denning was so keyed up that his mind was tense and observant of every detail, and he clearly remembers the exact words that Halpin uttered. They are in some little-known tongue, and I have failed to find a translation, so I repeat them here for any student who may care to look them up. "Ia psocharo," he cried. "Nug, toporthical shelimo, macthokwi hanel." At the cry, the horror moved. It stooped and took a short step toward the uncowering Halpin. Its facial rosette rose just as a man lifts his eyebrows in surprise. And then, speech came from its lips. Halpin strangely answered it in English. "I claim the forfeit," he cried boldly. "Never has one of your kind been released that it did not grant to whoever released it one wish, were it in its power to grant it." The thing bowed, actually bowed. In deep, inhumanly deep tones, it gave what was manifestly an assent. It clasped its hands over what should have been its breast and bowed, in what even the paralyzed Denning could tell was certainly mock humility. "Very well, then," the heedless Halpin went on. "I want to know. That is my wish to know. All my life I have been a student, seeking, and learning nothing. And now I want to know the why of things, the cause, the reason, in the end to which we travel. Tell me the place of man in this universe, in the place of this universe in the cosmos." The thing, the jinni, or whatever it was, bowed again. Why was it that Halpin could not see its mockery? It clasped those amazingly human hands together. It drew them apart, and from fingertips to fingertips leaped a maze of sparks. In that maze of brilliant filaments, a form began to take shape, became rectangular, took on solidity, and became a little window. A silvery latticed window whose panes were seemingly transparent, but which looked out upon, from where Denning stood, it seemed nothing but blackness. The creature's head made a gesture, and it spoke a single word, the only word which it spoke that Denning recognized. "Look," it said, and obeying, Halpin stepped forward and looked through that window. Denning says that Halpin stared while you might have counted 10. Then he drew back a step or two, stumbled against the couch and sat down. "Oh," he said softly, very softly, and then, "Oh, I see." Denning says he said it like a little child that had just had some problem explained by a doting parent, and he made no attempt to rise, no comment, nor any further word of any kind. And the jinni, the elder one, demon or angel or whatever it was, bowed again and turned around, and was gone. Then suddenly, somehow or other, Denning's trance of fright was over, and he rushed to the light switch and flooded the room with light. An empty jar lay upon the floor, and upon the couch sat one who stared and stared into vacancy with a look of unutterable despair on his face. Little more need be said. Denning called his wife, gave her a brief and distorted tale which he later amplified for the police, and spent the rest of the night trying to rouse Halpin. When morning came, he sent for a doctor and had Halpin removed to his own home. From there, Halpin was taken to the state asylum for the insane where he still is. He sits constantly in meditation, unless one tries to arouse him, and then he turns on them a sad, pitying smile and returns to his musings. And except for that sad, pitying smile, his only look is one of unutterable despair. End of Out of the Jar by Charles R. Tanner. The Intruder by Emil Petaja. Futuria Fantasia, Winter 1940. It was in San Francisco, on the walk above the sand and surf that pounded like the heart of the earth. There was wind, the sky and sea blended in a grey mist. I was sitting on a stone bench watching a faint hint of distant smoke, wondering what ship it was and from what far port. Mine was a pleasant wind, loneliness. So when he came, wrapped in his great overcoat and muffler, hat pulled down, and sat on my bench, I was about to rise and leave him. There were other benches, and I was not in the mood for idle gossip about Hitler and taxes. "Don't go, please." His plea was authentic. "I must get back to my shop," I said. "Surely you can spare a moment." I could not even to begin to place the accent in his voice, low as a whisper, tense. His deep-set eyes held me. His face was pale and had a serenity born of suffering, a placid face, not given to emotional betrayals, yet mystical. I sat down again. Here was someone bewilderingly strange, someone I wouldn't soon forget. He moved a hand toward me, as though to hold me from going, and I saw with mild curiosity that he wore heavy gloves, like mittens. "I am not well. I must not be out in the damp air," I said. "But today I just had to go out and walk. I had to. I can understand." I warmed to the wave of aloneness that lay in his words. "I too have been ill. I know you, Otis Marlin. I have visited your shop off Market Street. You are not rich, but the feel of the covers on a fine book between your hands suffices. Am I right?" I nodded. "But how? You have tried writing, but have had no success. Alone in the world, your loneliness has much a family man, harassed might envy." "That's true," I admitted, wondering if he could be a seer, a fake mystic bent on arousing in me an interest in spiritism favorable to his pocketbook. His next words were a little amused, but he didn't smile. "No, I'm not a psychic. In the ordinary sense, I visited your shop. I was there only yesterday," he said, and I remembered him. In returning from my lunch, I had met him coming out of my humble place of business. One glimpse into those brooding eyes was not a thing to soon forget, and I recalled pausing to watch his stiff-legged progress down the street and around the corner. There was now a pause, while I watched leaves scuttling along the oiled walk in the growling wind. Then a sound like a sigh came from my companion. It seemed to me that the wind and the sea spoke loudly of a sudden, as though approaching some dire climax. The sea wind chilled me as it had not before. I wanted to leave. "Dare I tell you, dare I?" His white face turned upward. It was as though he questioned some spirit in the winds. I was silent, curious, yet fearful of what it might be he might not be allowed to tell me. The winds were portentously still. "Were you ever told as a child that you must not attempt to count the stars in the sky at night, that if you did you might lose your mind?" "Why, yes. I believe I've heard that old superstition. Very reasonable, I believe, based on the assumption that the task would be too great for one brain." I suppose it never occurred to you," he interrupted, "that this superstition might hold even more truth than that, truth as malignant as it is vast. Perhaps the cosmos holds secrets beyond comprehension of man, and what is your assurance that these secrets are beneficent and kind? Is nature rather not terrible than kind? In the stars are patterns, designs which, if read, might lure the intrepid miserable one who reads them out of earth and beyond to immeasurable evil. Do you understand what I am saying?" His voice quivered metallically, was vibrant with emotion. I tried to smile, but managed only a sickly grin. "I understand you, sir, but I am not in the habit of accepting nebulous theories such as that without any shred of evidence. There is, sad to say, only too much evidence. But do you believe that men have lost their minds from incessant study of the stars?" "Perhaps some have, I don't know," I returned. "But in the south of this state, in one of the country's leading observatories, I have a friend who is famous as an astronomer. He is as sane as you or I, if not saner." I tacked the last sentence on with significant emphasis. The fellow was muttering something into his muffler, and I fancied I caught the words danger and fools. We were silent again. Low, dark clouds fled over the roaring sea, and the gloom intensified. Presently, in his clipped speech, the stranger said, "Do you believe that life exists on other planets, other stars? Have you ever wondered what kind of life might inhabit the other stars in this solar system and those beyond it?" His eyes were near mine as he spoke, and they bewitched me. There was something in them, something intangible and awful. I sensed that he was questioning me idly, as an outlander might be questioned about things with which the asker is familiar, as I might ask a New Yorker, "What do you think of the Golden Gate Bridge?" "I wouldn't attempt to guess, to describe, for instance, a Martian man," I said. Yet I read with interest various guesses by writers of fiction. I was striving to maintain a mood of lightness and ease, but inwardly I felt a bitter cold, as one on the rim of a nightmare. I suddenly realized with childish fear that night was falling. Writers of fiction, and what if they were to guess too well? What then? Is it safe for them to have full reign over their imaginations, like the stargazers? I said nothing but smiled. Perhaps, man, there have been those whose minds were acute beyond most earthly minds, those who have guessed too closely to truth. Perhaps those who are beyond are not yet ready to make themselves known to earthlings, and maybe they are annoyed with the puny publicity they receive from imaginative writers. Ask yourself, what is imagination? Are earth minds capable of conceiving that which is not and has never been? Or is this imagination merely a deeper insight into worlds you know not of, worlds glimpsed dimly in the throes of dream? And whence come these dreams? Tell me, have you ever awakened from a dream with the sinister feeling that all was not well inside your mind, that while you, the real you, were away in limbo, something was probing in your mind, invading it and reading it? Might not they leave behind them in departure shadowy trailings of their own minds? Now I was indeed speechless, for a strange nothing had started my neck hairs to prickling. Authors who might have guessed too well. 2, no 3, writers whose stories had hinted at inconceivable yet inevitable dooms, writers I had known, had recently died by accident. What of old legends? Of the serpent who shall one day devour the sun? That legend dates back to Mu and Atlantis. Who, man, was and is Satan, Christ and Jehovah, benevolent and all-saving, were but a monstrous jest fostered by they to keep man blindly content, and keep him divided among himself so that he strove not to unravel the stars. Man, in my foolish youth I studied by candle flames secrets that would scorch your very soul, of women who with their own bare hands have strangled the children they bore so that the world might not know. Disease and sickness at which physicians throw up their hands in helpless bafflement, when strong men tear at their limbs and heads in agony, seeking to drive forth alien forces that have netted themselves into their bodies. I need scarcely recount them all, each with its own abominable significance. It is them, who are eternal and nameless, who send their scouts down to test Earthman. Don't you realize that they have watched man creep out of primal slimes, take limbs and shamble, and finally walk, and that they are waiting, biding their time? I shivered with a fear beyond name. I tried to laugh and could not. Then, bold with stark horror, I shouted quite loudly, "How do you know this? Are you one of them?" He shook his head violently. "No, no." I made as to go, feeling an aching horror within me. "Stay only a moment more, man. I will have pity on you and will not tell you all. I will not describe them, and I will not essay that which, when upon first seeing you here by the sea, I first intended." I listened, not daring to look at him, as in the grip of demoniac dream. My fingers clutched at the edges of the bench so tightly that I have been unable to write with them until now. He concluded thus, "So you see that I am everywhere a worldless alien. Sometimes this secret is too great for one mind to contain, and I must talk. I must feel the presence of someone human near me, else I shall attempt to commit suicide, and again fail. It is without end, my horror. Have pity on me, man of earth, as I have had pity on you." It was then that I gripped him by the shoulders and looked with pleading desperation into his staring eyes. "Why have you told me?" "What?" My voice broke. My hands fell to my sides. I shuddered. He understood. Shrieked one word, "Pity," into my insensible ear, and was gone. That was 3 nights ago, and each night since has been hell. I cannot remember how long it was after the stranger left that I found myself able to move, to rise, hobble home, suddenly ancient with knowledge, and I cannot, will not, reveal to you all that I heard. I thought myself insane, but after an examination, a physician pronounced me that I had been strained mentally. I am competent, but I wonder if he is wrong. I view the silken stars tonight with loathing. He sought to master their inscrutable secret meaning, and succeeded. He imagined, he dreamed, and he fed his sleep with potions, so that he might learn where his mind might be during sleep, and himself probe into the mind that wandered from space into his resting body shell. I am no scientist, no biochemist, so I learned little of his methods. Only that he did succeed in removing his mind from Earth and soaring to some remote world over and beyond this universe where they dwell. And they knew him to be a mind of Earth, he told me. He but hinted of the evil he beheld, so potent with dread that it shattered his mind. And they cured him and sent him back to Earth. "They are waiting," he shrieked, in his grating skeleton of a voice. "They are contemptuous of man and his feeble colonies, but they fear that some day, like an overgrown idiot child, he may do them harm. But before this time, when man has progressed into a ripeness, they will descend. Then they will come in hordes to exploit the world as they did before." Of his return, and his assuming the role of a man, the alien spoke evasively. It was to be asserted that this talk of his was not some repulsive caprice, to know that all of it was true, that I gripped him and beheld him. To my everlasting horror, I must know. Little in itself what I saw, but sufficient to cause me to sink down on the stone bench in a convulsive huddle of fear. Never again in life can I tear this clutching terror from my soul. Only this, that when I looked into his staring eyes in the dimness of murky twilight, and before he understood and quickly avaunted, I glimpsed with astoundment and repugnance that between the muffling of his coat and black scarf, the intruder wore a meticulously painted metal mask to hide what I must not see. End of the Intruder, Emil Petaja. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.